You just said a few minutes ago that where you broke in was where the ovens were. When you broke in, what did you think they were?
We walked over. We didn't think anything. We walked over to the ovens and looked in and saw burnt bodies.
What physical state were the bodies in?
Most of them were skeleton. They were really bare skin. The ribs were sticking out. It was one of the things that I could never believe that another human being could do this to them. But they did.
During one of the darkest periods in human history, the sinister reign of Nazi concentration camps emerged. Certain places persist in collective memory as evidence of unprecedented atrocity. Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Mauthausen, and Dachau were more than mere detention spaces. They became infernal domains where human dignity was brutally annihilated. As if massacring them wasn't enough, many were forced into grueling labor. The horrifying notion of extermination through labor was conceived by Third Reich officials. There, the weak and sick quickly met their death, while those deemed fit to work faced a nightmare of toil and torment. The figures of innocent deaths surpass any abstraction and go beyond human understanding. It is estimated that between 5 and 6 million Jews, as well as other ethnic, political, and social groups deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime, were murdered in these prisons during the Holocaust. The numbers include those who died in gas chambers, as well as those who perished due to diseases, starvation, forced labor, and other horrors. Join us in this new military history video to unravel the most abhorrent details and ruthless practices of the worst Nazi concentration camps.
Tenía que encontrarse un término, una palabra que describiera todas las matanzas, exterminio, violencia que sucedieron durante esta conflagración. Se encontró la palabra holocausto.
Let's first talk about the most well-known, the sadly infamous extermination camp of Auschwitz. From 1940 to 1945, the sinister collaboration of the deportation police and the SS, the paramilitary and security organization of the Nazi Party, condemned at least 1,300,000 souls to this macabre complex. Of all of them, the vast majority met their tragic end. Meticulous records reveal the staggering human cost. Jews, non-Jewish Poles, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and others fell victim to the Nazi war machine. In turn, the grounds were divided into two main sectors. Auschwitz-Birkenau, the principal camp, arose from the ashes of abandoned Polish military barracks near Auschwitz. Prisoners, forced into labor, toiled under the watchful eyes of their oppressors, where lives were stripped of all value, reduced to mere cogs in a monstrous apparatus of destruction. Amidst the horrors of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the specter of Dr. Josef Mengele, the camp's official physician, loomed threateningly. Within Block 10, he conducted grotesque experiments, surpassing even the vilest imaginations. The newly arrived scientist built himself a laboratory where he perpetrated his most grotesque and aberrant experiments. Obsessed with twins, especially identical ones, he subjected them to procedures in a twisted quest to understand heredity and increase the births of Aryan twins. This included blood transfusions between incompatible types, deliberate infections of one twin with a disease to observe its effect on the other, and bloody surgeries such as amputations or castrations. Children also endured horrendous experiments with injections to alter eye color, unnecessary interventions, and X-rays. People with dwarfism and disabilities were not spared, enduring exhaustive measurements and extractions of healthy teeth. But the macabre curiosity did not stop there. Mengele forced siblings to have sexual relations, aiming to study the quality of the resulting children. He dissected the thighs of several murdered prisoners to use as culture material in his laboratory. He compelled a lactating mother to cover her nipples with adhesive tape to calculate how long a newborn could survive without feeding. His experiments embodied the depravity of the Nazi regime and the most horrendous side of scientific epistemology. However, it wasn't just the experiments that tainted Auschwitz with infamy. It was the calculated orchestration of mass murder that defined its darkest hours. Auschwitz-Birkenau became the epicenter of genocide. Here, the chilling efficiency of death reached its peak. Secret chambers disguised as showers were central to the massive slaughter of innocents, their screams silenced under a cloak of deceit. With cold precision, the SS categorized the condemned. Some were destined for forced labor, while others unknowingly marched toward their doom. This is attested by Annette Cabelli, one of the few women survivors of this camp.
Nos dejaron en la frontera y nos ponieron en trenes abiertos. Comíamos la nieve. Más del 50% de deportados se murieron así.
The liberation of Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, revealed to the world the magnitude of the horrors perpetrated. Despite the advance of the Red Army, the extermination camp still held thousands of prisoners. The unbearable stench and the sight of mountains of shoes and corpses were the Soviet soldiers' first impressions. Soon, hundreds of thousands of garments and tons of human hair belonging to Holocaust victims were discovered. Primo Levi, a survivor of Auschwitz, described it as the industrialization of death, where human life lacked value and prisoners were treated as mere numbers. After Auschwitz, it is now necessary to speak of the brutality of Bergen-Belsen camp. It was here that Anne Frank, the young writer whose heartbreaking diaries later became known, met her tragic end, shaved, infested with lice, and ill. Established in 1935 as a detention center for Nazi opponents, the SS directly transformed it into an extermination camp. Although lacking gas chambers, prisoners met their end through epidemics, forced labor, and the brutality of their captors. It was here that Anne and her sister Margot were transferred in October 1944, only to lose their lives 2 days before liberation. Conditions were horrific. Overcrowding, malnutrition, and disease ravaged the captive population. As the war neared its end, Bergen-Belsen became a dumping ground for evacuees from other camps, pushing its population to unbearable levels. Under SS officers like Adolf Haas and Josef Kramer, Bergen-Belsen descended into chaos. Among the guards, figures like Irene Haschke and Irma Griese gained notoriety for their brutal methods. Inside, the law of the jungle reigned. During the night, the struggle for survival often involved extreme acts of violence. Cannibalism in Bergen-Belsen was a gruesome reality, though not widespread. Survivor testimonies and historical reports indicate that some prisoners, in a state of extreme desperation and attempting to obtain nutrition, resorted to cannibalism by consuming the bodies of those who had died in the camp. These actions were carried out in secrecy and under utmost clandestinity, due to the taboo and horror associated with this practice. The end of horror finally arrived on April 15, 1945, with the liberation of Bergen-Belsen by British forces. As troops advanced into Nazi territory, they encountered evidence of the atrocities committed by the regime. The camp overflowed with emaciated and sick prisoners, many on the verge of perishing. Thousands of corpses lay unburied, and the stench of death permeated the cold air. Despite the overwhelming challenges they faced, the British immediately set to work providing aid to the survivors. Dozens of medical teams worked tirelessly to treat the sick and wounded, while efforts were made to provide food, water, and basic sanitation to those in need. However, the magnitude of the humanitarian crisis was immense, and despite their best efforts, many prisoners succumbed to disease and malnutrition in the days following liberation. As the third on the list of the worst extermination camps, we have Mauthausen. Located amidst the picturesque Austrian landscape, and despite being less known than the previous two, Mauthausen stands as a grim testament to cruelty. Liberated by the 11th Armored Division of the United States on May 5, 1945, this place of torment quickly earned a reputation for brutality, forming the epicenter of a network of systematic violence that claimed countless lives. From political adversaries to Jews, Roma, and others deemed undesirable, Mauthausen spared no one. The daily life of prisoners in the camp was a struggle against the ruthless dictates of their captors. Often in agonizing conditions, inmates bore the weight of stones on the infamous stairs of death, where fatigue and brutality awaited those who faltered. Any misstep would trigger a horrific chain reaction, crushing limbs and bodies. Sometimes, SS guards forced exhausted prisoners to run upstairs carrying blocks of stone. People perished on Mauthausen's stairs of death daily, and those who survived were placed in a terrifying lineup at the edge of a cliff known as the parachutist's wall. Prison guards aimed a gun at each prisoner, who had the choice of being shot or the prisoner in front of them off the cliff. Frequent, as many prisoners saw this as a form of escape. Mauthausen was classified as a Grade 3 camp, reserved for incorrigible political enemies of the Reich to be exterminated or die from exhaustion through labor. It had such a horrific reputation that the SS called Mauthausen Knochenmühle, or the bone grinder. In total, over 122,000 people died inside due to causes such as extreme fatigue, diseases, executions, and even Today, the stairs of death are part of guided tours at the memorial site. These steps have been renovated and straightened so that tourists can easily ascend and descend, but at that time, they were steep and slippery. The horrors of Mauthausen extended beyond physical labor into the realms of medical experimentation and systematic murder. However, glimmers of resistance illuminated the shadows. Brave souls defied their oppressors, risking their lives to disrupt the machinery of death and offer hope to their fellow prisoners. As the war drew to a close, this place became a refuge for evacuees from other camps. Its collapsed barracks and silent yards serve as a testament to the millions who perished within its walls.
No tiene explicación. Yo no te lo puedo explicar lo que me pasó.
Lastly, we cannot fail to mention the macabre place that pioneered all hells, Dachau. Over 90 years ago, on March 22, 1933, the Nazi regime established one of its first concentration camps. It served as a model for the systematic extermination of people, setting the stage for the horrors that would unfold elsewhere. Here, the infamous slogan Arbeit macht frei, translating to work sets you free, greeted prisoners at the entrance, a cruel mockery of their situation. It was established on March 10, 1933, just over 5 weeks after Adolf Hitler became chancellor. Built on the outskirts of the town of Dachau, about 12 miles north of Munich during World War II, the main camp was supplemented by around 150 branches scattered throughout southern Germany and Austria, all together called Dachau. Throughout Dachau's history, at least 160,000 prisoners passed through the main camp and 90,000 through its branches. Incomplete records indicate that at least 32,000 prisoners died there from disease, malnutrition, physical oppression, and execution. But countless more were transported to extermination centers in German-occupied Poland. The composition of the prisoners reflected the Nazis' changing choice of victims. Initially, Social Democrats, communists, and other political prisoners were detained. Later victims included Roma and homosexuals, as well as Jehovah's Witnesses. Jews were brought to Dachau after Kristallnacht in November 1938. This place received Jews again after the winter death marches of 1944-45. Dachau became the prototype for Nazi prisons. Its first commandant, T0RTURE, created the organizational structure. A gas chamber was built there in 1942 but was never used. Those slated for gassing were reassigned to Auschwitz, while the sick were sent to Hartheim, one of the T4 euthanasia centers established to euthanize the disabled. Moreover, Dachau was the first and most important laboratory where German doctors and scientists conducted experiments using prisoners as guinea pigs. Nazi scientists studied the effects of freezing on warm-blooded animals and infected Jews with malaria. They then treated them with various drugs of unknown effects and tested the consequences of drinking seawater.
The American soldiers found more than 30 railroad cars filled with bodies in various states of decomposition. It was a moment when they understood the origin of the smell. It was the overpowering stench of death.
Dachau was liberated by American troops on April 29, 1945. Among their most macabre discoveries were train cars filled with Jewish prisoners who had died en route and were left to decompose. The American and British media coverage of this and other recently liberated camps, including published photographs in magazines and footage shown in cinemas, deeply shaped public understanding of the atrocities that had occurred. After the war, scientists and doctors from Dachau and other camps were tried in Nuremberg. 7 of them were sentenced to death. Below, you will see a few seconds from the famous doctor's trial. During the trial, Brigadier General Telford Taylor was the chief prosecutor. In his opening statement for the prosecution, Taylor said, "The defendants in this case are charged with murders, tortures, and other atrocities committed in the name of medical science. The number of victims of these crimes runs into hundreds of thousands. Only a few survived." Among the doctors convicted in the doctor's trial, Victor Brack stands out, who was tried for his involvement in the Nazi euthanasia program and for his role in the organization and execution of atrocious medical experiments. He was sentenced to death. Karl Brandt, Adolf Hitler's personal physician and Reich Commissioner for Health and Sanitation, was accused of planning and carrying out inhumane medical practices on concentration camp prisoners, as well as participating in the mass murder of people deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. Brandt was also sentenced to death and executed. As for Joseph Mengele, known as the Angel of Death, he was neither captured nor tried after the war. It is believed that he lived out the rest of his life in southern Argentina. He later died in Brazil in 1979, reportedly drowning, possibly while being pursued for justice.
In Ravensbrück, they didn't put us into any of the barracks. They right away straight put us into the Totenbark, into a barrack for death, for killing. And the method they used was that into an area that that could hold 100 people, they put 1,500. And there was no room to stand. There was no furniture in the place. There was no room to stand, so some people were hanging in the air.
Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Mauthausen, and Dachau witnessed inconceivable suffering during the Holocaust and embodied the darkest horrors of humanity. Today, the memory of these places reminds us of the importance of honoring the victims and keeping historical awareness alive. The worst Nazi concentration camps allow us to remember the past to prevent the repetition of such atrocities in the future. That concludes the story. If you want to learn more about the Jewish Holocaust and World War II, don't forget to subscribe to Military History. Thank you, and until next time.